Dear friends, we rarely think about how distant the history is. Now the official media is saying that there is a possibility of the revival of that very Ottoman Empire. But just few people know that the Ottoman Empire has a completely different origin. Now let's think over again. I'll tell you. The Ottoman Empire. What dates do you think about in your mind? Let me guess, you are most likely thinking about the Middle Ages. But few people know that actually the Ottoman Empire died on March the 3rd, 1923. I didn't misspeak, less than 100 years ago. And it means that Turkey is not so friendly to us if talking about the events in Nagorno-Karabakh that we now see directly in the media. Armenia, Azerbaijan, and other Caucasian territories are just a part of a big plan for the revival of the Ottoman Empire. But actually, that very Ottoman Empire has also several levels of historical development. Unfortunately, we are not told about it in our high school history classes, but it's written directly on Wikipedia. You just don't know what to look for. Well, today, let's discuss the caliphate revival around the world. And actually, it's very dangerous. So, it's important to note that, in fact, the Ottoman Empire itself appeared in 1299, but before that something once happened. I highly recommend you to rewatch our forecasts, our prophecies about what will happen in the next 30 years on Earth's planet, because we talked about that very epidemic back in January 2019, when we predicted that a terrible virus would come from China and hit almost the whole world. Also, in 2018, I told you about the unification of Russia with other states in the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. At that time, I said that Ukraine, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan will unite against Russia. Once before, all this has already been said, but now the most important thing. Today, we have the Caucasus in a special fire. Not only the Caucasus beyond the territory of the Russian Federation, but the Russian Caucasus will also flare up in the near future. And if today Georgia seems to be out of the military events, everything will change catastrophically in the near future. Moreover, if you remember, quite recently, Ukraine and Turkey signed a military agreement that if necessary to reconquer the Crimea, then Ukraine will turn to Turkey. Also, quite recently, a meeting which was attended by the presidents of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan was held, and among other things, there was a discussion about military cooperation with Turkey. So, these events are not so fantastic. First of all, they show that our country is almost in the run-up to a future war. But if we talk about whether the Ottoman Empire, about which we took classes at school, is that one which will be discussed today, and which in fact is a successor of a very global clan, I mean the Holy Roman Empire. So that's what I'll tell you about today. Well, let's start from afar. Excuse me that, as it would seem, I'll start talking about today's events starting from 1.5 billion years ago. Well, it just so happened that all these events are completely related. So, 1.5 billion years ago, on Earth's planet, almost the whole territory was underwater, excepting of just a few global dry lands. Relatively speaking, the lands were the huge state which in the ancient Vedic culture is called as Darius was located. As you remember, Darius consisted of many archipelagos, between that rivers and lakes flowed, and there was even a huge ocean. This is because there was a huge flood at that time. Further, a little later, about 150,000 years ago, another interesting event took place. And after all, it would seem that from 1.5 billion I somehow skipped ahead to 150,000 years ago. However, those who watched our project of the creation of the world know that actually there were no any millions years ago, and this is because at that time there was a completely different atmosphere. We talked about this in detail there, so it makes no sense to stop on this. However, thanks to our numerological and mathematical researches, we managed to find an amendment of 8,000 years. Therefore, 1.5 billion years ago in the Silicon chronology is nothing else than 176,000 years ago in our chronology. And now we see that from 176,000 to 150,000 years, there is no such a great distance. So, exactly 150,000 years ago, this huge territory that almost had already been freed from water started gaining attributes of statehood. But the most important thing is that at that time, there was the only state on the territory of Earth's planet, and it was called as Ruskalan. This is exactly what historians and those who study ancient Russian fairy tales write about. So, almost all the myths and all the tales about unusual animals, unusual abilities of the people of ancient Rus also lead us exactly towards such a state as Ruskolan. Due to the fact that the water was at still high level, it was very dangerous to locate the capital somewhere in the lowlands, almost near the water. That's why the capital of the country of Ruskolan, which was called Kiyar, was located in the mountains, which we now call the Elbrus region, and Elbrus in particular. And at that time it was called completely differently, namely the Alatir Mountains. You see how interesting it is? That very Alatir and the state next to it. Well, of course, modern historians are already frankly saying that indeed the state of Ruskalan wasn't the maps of the ancient world. Moreover, they consider that it was the first Aryan state, and the information I've just told you is from Wikipedia. Well, now let's move on. So, this huge state was located on that very land plane. Moreover, the word land has the same root as the English word land and means some kind of territory. So the word land got into modern English language and sounds like land. Well, we see that indeed this state did not just exist, but most importantly, it gave an impetus to the formation of modern English words. So, there was a huge state, and what happened later? Surprisingly, according to the maps, a little later, the state of Ruskalan was already called a little differently. Just about 150,000 years ago, a split in the Russian world occurred. That's why later on the maps it was called as Ruskolon, which comes from the ancient Russian word kuloi, and the meaning of this word is close to split. So Rus split into two large blocks. In the Vedic culture, this time is called as Asadei and dates back exactly the same, 150,000 years ago. We will return to this later. The most important thing is that by that moment, that huge state, as I said, split into two states, northern and southern one. So the territory of the northern state started from the modern lake that's called as Tartar. That's why Tartaria was the northern state, and the southern state was populated mainly by those who didn't want following the ancient Vedic culture, and most importantly, they didn't want to develop magical abilities and went towards technologies. Later we called them as Atlanteans, but in fact, in more ancient times, they were called as the Twilight people. So there was Tartaria and the Twilight people. And if we write the word twilight in Russian but with Latin alphabet, we'll get the word Sumer, which means twilight in Russian. That's why the so-called ancient Sumer, which was located exactly in the southern territory of the former Ruskoland, got a great promotion from historians. So, Sumer was the southern territory of Rus. But the most important thing is that when our modern scientists studied the Sumerian language, they discovered an interesting feature. Firstly, 90% of the words of the ancient Sumer not just sound the same as Russian words, but also have the same meaning. That's amazing, isn't it? And if the Russian words are just suddenly get some hissing shade, then we get the Sumerian language again. And the remaining 10% of the words forming the ancient Sumerian, or more precisely Akkadian language, gave impetus to the formation of the English language. So we get that the Akkadian language is 90% formed of the Russian language and 10% of modern English. That already suggests that there was a coup. And if we recall that Akkadian or Sumerian story about the gods, we will understand that it turns out that for the first time that very reptilians came and landed in the northern lands of Tartaria, but the Russian knights drove them away from that territory and most importantly sent them to the southern territory. And over there, they were welcomed with open arms because they transferred a lot of technologies. Moreover, there is an expression to run with his tail between his legs, and all because reptilians are ophidian beings and they really have a tail. I also want to draw your attention to one very interesting quote. It is in the Apocrypha, the Gospel of Andrew, Apocrypha, chapter 5, verses 1, 2, and 3. Before I read this quote, I want you to remember that once the real Jesus Christ, whose name was Radomir, indeed went to the Israeli lands in order to heal them from the wrong vision of the world, since it was parasitic and was mostly aimed at the destruction of Vedic Rus. Nevertheless, some of the phrases of Jesus, Radomir himself, were altered, and they came in history with a different context. Now I will read the original one to you. So, and Andrew Ionin, his disciple, asked, Rabbi, to what nations to bring the good news of the kingdom of heaven? Once again, Radomir went to those lands in order to bring the good news, and his disciple asks which nations need to be given the correct Vedic history, and he answers, Go to the peoples of the east, the peoples of the west, and the peoples of the south, thereby the Sumerian, where the sons of the house of Israel live. Do not go to the pagans of the north, to the Tartarians, for they are sinless and do not know vices and sins of the house of Israel. This is what a real quote was back then. And now, attention, one more feature. Remember, I said that for the first time, the seizure of Rus took place 150,000 years ago, when the reptilians landed to the planet. And surprisingly, it was at that very moment when the Sumerian, not the Twilight one, but Sumerian civilization started forming, and one of the greatest symbols of that civilization was a very well-known sign. This is a crescent moon and a star next to it. It was a symbol of one of the gods of ancient Sumer, and his name was Sinan. I've researched multitude of sources, and after all, I've deeply studied the Sumerian Akkadian history, but surprisingly, I have not found the god Sinan excepting his main symbol, and I consider all because the god Sinan was not that very being. Most likely, it was an idea, like modern Zionism today is a political movement. and the god Sinan personified a certain political vector that the future civilization of the Sumerians had to follow. So further, the Sumerian civilization disintegrated and new one, the so-called ancient Egyptian state, which at that time was the successor of Sumer, started forming. So they had the Isis goddess, the goddess of death, who also had a symbol in the form of a crescent moon and a star nearby. Later, when the ancient Egyptian civilization disintegrated too, and there was that very famous exodus of Moses and the Jews from Egypt, they founded the next state, which the same was the successor of the ancient Sumerian civilization. At that time, it was called as Khazaria. Unfortunately, this state is almost not described in historical sources, but I'm 100% sure that one of the symbols of this state was a crescent moon and a star too. Later, after disintegration of that very Khazaria, thanks to the Russian princes, another empire was founded on European territory, the Empire of Evil, which was called as the Holy Roman Empire. And the symbol of the empire was an eagle sitting on a wreath in the shape of a crescent moon, and again there was a star above its head. Moreover, in later times, when the Roman Empire had already disintegrated into Western and Eastern, another symbol had appeared. It was a bull, and there was a star in its horns, so another crescent and a star. Later, in modern religious culture, the image of a bull with these horns in the form of a crescent moon and a star became the prototype of the modern devil, or as it's also to be called, Baphomet or Satan. Thus, we understand that the ancient Sumerian gods went a long way from Sumer itself through Egypt, Khazaria, the Holy Roman Empire, and strange as it may seem, came into the Ottoman territory. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But the most important thing is that 150,000 years ago, when that very Sumerian civilization appeared, it was originally divine civilization, so the world was ruled by the gods. And 6,000 years ago, when the so-called king of Hammurabi appeared, and now I'm talking about the preamble in the laws of Hammurabi, the great god Anu, the leader of Anunnaki, remember? So this god Anu passed the laws down to Hammurabi, and from that moment, that is 6,000 years ago, as it turned out, the gods moved over from the planetary management and made a priesthood, the priests of the god Anu, and later, after the seizure, they became the priests of the god Marduk. We talked about this in detail in our project of the Eye of the Snake. So, 6,000 years ago, the so-called modern human history was born. Well, now let's get closer to that very Ottoman Empire. Remind you that the Holy Roman Empire was the evil empire. It was ruled mainly by people, but they received an information about the direction for their action from the infernal world through the priestesses who communicated with spirits and in fact with reptilians. It was these priestesses who suggested where to direct the power of the Roman Empire. Their task was to crush the Vedic roots, destroying it at its root. At that period of time, the Holy Roman Empire founded a lot of secret cults and societies, and the first one was the Priory of Sion. We will talk about this secret society in other projects. What I'm now more interested in is that the Holy Roman Empire had two main fields. Relatively speaking, the management was divided into two blocks. The first were the so-called Sephardim. They were the rich, like the modern banks. It was the Sephardim who later succeeded in founding the Ottoman Empire. Well, as for the other knights of the Round Table, unfortunately, almost all of them were exterminated. But it's important to say another thing, that among the ruling dynasty of the Roman Empire, there were no Italians or any other nationalities excepting the Sephardim, and the Sephardim are Jews. That's why exactly exactly Khazars founded the Holy Roman Empire. Then another empire was founded. It was not so dangerous as that very Ottoman Empire. It was founded in 1299. Surprisingly, the Ottoman Empire comes from the Russian word combination Osmanov that could be translated as excess of people, and it was a huge squad that consisted of the Slavic population. Sure, they could have different religions, it's hard to say since the history very poorly describes this period of the Ottoman era, but another thing is important, that in Rus, those very Ottomans were called in Russian as Skazaki, which means speakers or storytellers, and only later as Cossacks, because they were familiar with the technique of the battle through the sound. Let's see how the clothes of the Cossack commanders and the Ottoman commanders looked like. And here, as they say, find 10 differences. They're absolutely the same, both in color and in appearance. Thus, the Ottoman Empire can be divided into several stages. The first stage is the emergence of the empire from 1299 to 1453. Relatively speaking, it was the Slavic Ottoman Empire, Kazaki or Cossacks, who helped Russia. Further, the expansion of the empire from 1453 to 1683. After that, the stagnation of the empire from 1683 to 1827, then the disintegration of the empire from 1827 to 1923, and the modern Turkish Republic from 1923. Thus, we get 5 stages of the Ottoman Empire, and only one of these stages was related to the ancient Rus. So, we had a ruler who could not cope with the Holy Roman Empire, especially with our territories in Europe, and he turned to our friendly states that founded that very Ottoman Empire. At that time, Mehmed II ruled. It was he who on March the 5th, 1453, managed to heroically destroy the last part of the Roman Empire. In fact, thanks to him, Babylon collapsed. Moreover, Babylon is the same as Bible. So, the modern Bible started to emerge exactly in those days and not in the 1st century after Christ. So, you can see how significantly the history has been rewritten. Further, that very Ottoman Empire, or Cossacks, the Slavic Cossacks, started to liberate the lands, and Mehmed II, to a greater extent, did not conquer but liberated the lands that once were seized by that Holy Roman Empire. And then something terrible happened. He had a son named Bayezid I. And what was the danger here? The thing was that the Sephardi gold tempted Bayezid I. At that time, almost all the rulers of the Roman Empire were eliminated. The most of the European territories, excepting Spain, Italy, and Portugal, were liberated, and the sovereignty was returned to them. So, the Ottoman Empire did not seize, but liberated territories. And in this matter, Mehmed II was the liberator, but Bayezid wanted to make friends with the Sephardim of Spain, Italy, and Portugal, and their money tempted him. So what he did? He killed his father. This is not my version, this is the official history. Indeed, at that time, Mehmed II was going to go on a military campaign to Egypt. It was the last place where the strongholds of that very Holy Roman Empire were located. But in his own military tent, where only his son Bayezid I had entered before, he was poisoned and died just a few hours later. Bayezid took his throne, and most importantly, he issued a decree. Let me read it to you. Here is his quote. "You dare to call Fernando to be a wise ruler," he told his courtiers, "but he is the one who impoverishes his own country and enriched mine." So, Fernando is that king in Spain who drove the Sephardic Jews of the former Holy Roman Empire out of his territory. And then, the most interesting thing, you see, he confesses, he says that he accepted these Sephardim and enriched himself at their expense. I read further. Bayezid threatened with death all those who would refuse Jews to enter the empire, so his father saved Rus from the Ottoman Empire and from the Holy Roman Empire, and his son Bayezid sold out himself. He allowed them to return to their territories, and moreover, the Sephardim became the so-called Viziers, about which we later learned from fairy tales such as the 1001 Nights. So Sephardim, the wealthy of the Holy Roman Empire, who had enriched themselves on the blood and death of the Slavs, suddenly became the Viziers. This is a very high position under a sultanate. So, Muslims and Jews of Al-Andalus contributed to the growing power of the Ottoman Empire through the introduction of new ideas, technologies, and skills. Thus, the first printing house of Constantinople was opened by the Sephardic Jews in 1493. This is a quote from Wikipedia. Everything is in front of our eyes, we just do not see. So Bayezid had two sons. The first was named Ahmed, the second was Selim I. Ahmed was furious when he knew that his father had killed his grandfather Mehmed II, and he rebelled against his own father. But this is not the point. He didn't want to kill him, unlike Selim I, and Selim I just the opposite. He was tempted by the Sephardi money and said that he would defend the interests of his father. Thus, Ahmed was defeated by the army of Selim I, but it was interesting later. Actually, Selim did not rule over the whole country, but just a part of it. And the great sultan at that moment in time was Bayezid I, his father. So where did that Selim I rule? And this is very interesting, this is our future. Selim I ruled the Crimean Khanate. Once again, Crimea was ruled by Selim I, and only since 1973 these territories have finally become ours. Until this moment, other peoples lived on the territory of Crimea. Selim I came from Crimea to his father Bayezid and demanded an immediate resignation, and Bayezid did it. Thus, on April the 25th, 1512, Bayezid abdicated in favor of Selim I, who in turn endowed all the Sephardim with unlimited power, who migrated from the Holy Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire. It was from this moment that the second wave of that very empire started. This empire is now called by historians as the Empire of Evil. How interesting, isn't it? It turns out that Selim I overthrew his father, who in turn overthrew his grandfather, and all for the sake of money, for the sake of glory, and most importantly, for the sake of increasing the Ottoman Empire. In historical references, Selim I is called not just a formidable but a fierce king. After all, his empire increased by 70% during his reign. He really was very cruel and eagerly wanted to expand the influence of the Ottoman Empire, and he went to Rus. And once, when his grandfather ruled, we were companions in arms, allies, and since 1512, not just the Sultanate appeared, but a caliphate. From that moment, that very Sephardim or caliphates already started to rule this state. So once again, I repeat, Selim I did not rule, he issued decrees at the behest of the Sephardim. Thus, we get a seizure of the Ottoman Empire and a new history. and that empire became the successor of the Holy Roman Empire, Khazaria, the ancient Egypt, and Sumer, and the Ottoman Empire serves the interests of Marduk. Oddly enough, Selim I did not rule for a long time, just since 1512 to 1520, and all because in 1520 a massive climatic changes, disasters, and earthquakes started, and there are lots of information about this has been written in historical documents. And most importantly, there was a smallpox epidemic at that time. Thus, we get that since 1420, every 100 years, we see some earthquakes, epidemics, and wars. 1320, 1520, 1620, and 1920 it was an epidemic of that very Spanish flu, and 2020 a modern virus that cannot be discussed. So Selim I got infected, and despite the fact that in just 8 years he significantly expanded the empire, he could not govern it. He understood that he was dying. Historians have an interesting version about this, that supposedly Selim I decided to poison his kaftan and send it to his son Suleiman I. But why? And the answer is very simple. The thing is that Suleiman I was very kind and would rather start the revival of the Vedic Rus than that very Ottoman, dark and evil empire. And then, according to historians, Selim I had the idea to kill his own son, because he was the only heir to the throne. And it's really strange, isn't it, to spend so much effort and no matter what the son was, after all, he was the heir to the throne by blood. Surprisingly, since the son had a very bad relationship with his father, Selim I, he didn't accept the kaftan, his gift. He gave it to his son. The first son of Suleiman I was conceived in 1512, the second one in 1513, and by that time when, in 1520, that kaftan was presented, the children were still small, so he passed it on to his children. Unfortunately, they both got infected smallpox and both died in 1521. At that time, Suleiman I did not even suspect that the problem was that kaftan. Well, now let's think. Was it advantageous? I think no. It was not at all advantageous for Selim to kill his heirs. However, the vizier had a benefit. His name was Joseph Nessi, and he once lived in Portugal, and he was also a Sephardic. In case of death of the whole royal family, he had a benefit, because according to the law, only he would take the throne of the Ottoman Empire, but fortunately, it didn't happen. After the death of Selim I, Suleiman I ascended the throne, and as expected, he was too kind, so he could not continue his father's work, and then the vizier himself came up with the brilliant idea of taking power through the sons of Suleiman I. There is a very long story, so I will read it if you don't mind. So, Suleiman I had several wives. The first concubine gave birth to his son Fulain, who died of smallpox on November the 29th, 1521, as I said. The second concubine, Gulfem Hatun, also gave birth to his son named Murad in 1513, who also died of smallpox in 1521. The third concubine of the Sultan was Mahidevran Sultan, also known as Gulbahar or Spring Rose. She was the mother of several children, including Mustafa. I would draw your attention to their son, Mustafa. He survived, he did not get smallpox, and in fact was the only heir to the throne due to the fact that his mother, first of all, was Ottoman and not some alien lady. In addition, he was the oldest son, the first minion, and the only concubine of Suleiman, with whom he married formally in 1534, was Harem Sultan. In Europe, she became known as Roxolana, and a big beautiful TV series, The Magnificent Century, was filmed about her. Yet, the story was strongly changed there. So, where did Roxolana come from? It's believed that she was taken prisoner during the military campaign, but in my opinion, she behaved too consciously. I have a feeling that the vizier sent her, since she was not of Muslim origin. She was mostly of Jewish origin, so the Sephardim sent their girl to Suleiman, and most importantly, in 1521 she gave birth to the son named Mehmed II, and after that the daughter Mirimah, the son Abdullah, and the son Selim II, and a little later another son, Sehangir. So, by 1553, someone already had to ascend the throne, because Suleiman I was also accidentally poisoned, so it was necessary to choose one of them. As I already said, two previous sons died in their childhood of smallpox, and further, Mustafa was supposed to ascend the throne, but the thing was that Mustafa had a strong enemy, that very Selim II, the son of that Roxolana. He slandered his own brother and said that he allegedly plotted a coup. Therefore, on March the 5th, 1553, Mustafa was executed and Selim II ascended the throne. Now, note the date of March the 5th. On March the 5th, 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered the Roman Empire, and exactly 100 years later, on March the 5th, 1553, the Ottoman Vedic Empire collapsed and the domination of the Ottoman Babylonian or Sumerian Empire has started. They are very observant about dates. Another interesting fact is that on March the 5th, 1553, the King of England was poisoned, and later the Queen, well known as Bloody Mary, ascended the throne of England. Also, on the same day of March the 5th, 1553, the Spanish king was poisoned and finally died, and his throne was also taken by the successor who turned towards the Ottoman Empire. Also, in Rus, on March the 5th, 1553, Ivan IV was poisoned, but miraculously was healed just in few days. Later, he suddenly killed his own son. Remember the history? So, starting exactly from March the 5th, 1553, he became Ivan the Terrible. All of this was a planned Sephardic operation that almost allowed them to seize power in the whole world. So Selim II subsequently killed all of his brothers as well as 5 of his nephews, the sons of his brother Bayezid II, who rebelled against him. All the males of the genus were exterminated, excepting him. But why exactly Selim II? Actually, there were many brothers, and that vizier could choose anyone. However, the name of Selim I was extremely important for these Sephardim and the Babylonian Ottoman Empire, because it was exactly him who the evil Ottoman Empire started from. Selim I was a hero for them, the one who killed his own father, who in turn killed Mehmed II the Conqueror. Selim I is the main figure in the Ottoman Empire. So, why am I focusing on Selim I? Now let's return to the dates. I draw your attention that there are few dates that are very important for the modern Ottoman Empire. Well, first of all, this is the date of birth of Selim I himself. I remind you that he was born on October the 10th, 1465, and died on September the 22nd, 1520. So, in 1512, the history of that twilight Ottoman Empire started. In 1512, I remind you, there were world wars. The next one is 1520, when Selim I was poisoned, and what happens every 100 years in the 20th year. There are epidemics. This is another act of Freemasons or Illuminati, I'm not sure who exactly, but secret societies in general. The next date, which is extremely important, is September the 22nd. A little later you will understand why. Let's go on. What are the other periods? The 53rd years. Why? Because in 1453 the Holy Roman Empire died, and in 1553 the Holy Roman Empire was reborn in the form of the Ottoman Empire. March the 5th is one of the important dates. April the 25th, July the 24th and the 27th. And as I previously said, September the 22nd and October the 10th. So exactly on these days, the Ottoman Empire will take some actions. Therefore, according to our forecasts, the Russian-Turkish War or the Russian-Vedic and Ottoman War will be started between July the 24th and July the 27th, 2021, and it will go on until September the 22nd, 2026. Now let's back to the contemporary events. Well, now you understand that actually the Ottoman Empire is that ancient Sumerian empire, and after all, the main task of the Ottoman Empire is to prepare a platform for the ascent of God Marduk. Let me remind you that we allocated few dates from our project of the Matrix Reloaded. We deciphered that revelation, and now we know that in 2026, let's say the Prince of Darkness have to rise up from the Black Sea as well as from the Gulf of Aden. So, there is the father god Enki in the Black Sea, and there is the sun god Marduk in the Gulf of Aden accordingly. So these lands of the Ottoman Empire will have to be transferred to the future Prince of Darkness. Therefore, if we look at the map of the spread of military front of a future war, we can understand that Ukraine for sure must do something for Turkey, some kind of gift, and we will talk about this in detail. And further, respectively, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Iraq, and so on. All these territories will be covered by military operations. Everything in order to prepare a bridgehead for an attack directly on the Holy Russian Empire. Therefore, if no one stops the Ottoman Empire in the near future, unfortunately, we will automatically enter a great war where Erdogan will not be just a kind of commander, but he will lead his army and his allies to the total destruction. Now I'm addressing Azerbaijan. You were deceived. Your territory will be completely cleaned up in the future. There simply cannot be any friendship between Turkey and Azerbaijan, because the territory should be transferred to Marduk by 2026. So let's recall the great king of that dark Sumerian Ottoman Empire, whose name was Selim I. And where did Selim I live? Do you remember? In Crimea. Therefore, Turkey's war for Crimea is inevitable. Now let's take a look at the modern media. Zelensky speaks frankly. He recognizes Crimea not as Ukrainian, but he recognizes Crimea as the Ottoman territory, and he is ready to enter the war for Crimea together with Turkey in order to give Crimea over to Turkey after that. We have been talking about this since 2017. Check out our forecasts on Julie Poe's channel. The Federation Council reacted to Erdogan's yesterday's statement about the status of Crimea. Senator Alexei Pushkov noted that while there are discussions about a possible alliance between Russia and Turkey, Ankara's rigid position on the peninsula's territorial affiliation is being overlooked. Remind you, the day before, Erdogan once again declared the non-recognition of the reunification of Crimea and Russia. The Turkish leader announced this at the joint press conference with the president of Ukraine. Erdogan's intransigence in this matter is based primarily on his desire to support the Crimean Tatars. We would draw your attention to the fact that actually they have always been wars for Crimea, and it was only in 1783 when Crimea started to belong to the Russian world. But until 1783, it was always either Ottoman or Khazar territory, or belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, and in fact to the same evil empire. Selim I is the father of their empire, and they will definitely return this territory back to the Ottoman Empire as a gift, as a tribute to the founders of the evil empire. Now let's recall when the Armenian-Turkish conflict started. September the 24th, 1920. It was exactly 100 years ago. Let me remind you that Selim I died on September the 22nd, 1520, and now I will read you a note from Wikipedia regarding what's happening now in Nagorno-Karabakh. According to sources in the Syrian National Army, up to 1,500 troops were deployed to the area of the upcoming armed conflict with the assistance of Turkey. The first groups of Syrians, according to these sources, started arriving in Azerbaijan via Turkey by September the 25th. The first tweet about the arrival of dozens of Hamza Division troops in Baku is dated, and now, attention, Wikipedia, September the 22nd, 2020. And if you say that it is a coincidence, I will be very surprised. The Jerusalem Post of September the 26th reported the dispatch of 200 ethnic Syrian Turkmens, troops of the Sultan Murad division, to the border with Armenia. At the same time, statements appeared in the Turkish media that the soldiers of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic Armed Forces are being trained by Kurdish terrorists. Turkish representatives intensified information pressure on Armenia, demanding to stop the aggression against Azerbaijan and stating that the Armenian leadership is playing with fire, illegally occupying Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me remind you that Nagorno-Karabakh once belonged to the state of Ruskolan, and there was the capital of our state. So, if we talk about who owns Nagorno-Karabakh, then let's rewind back about 1.5 billion years ago, or in our chronology, 176,000 years ago. That was Russian land, and this territory has always been ours. Let me remind you that even after the split of Ruskolan, the territory of that very great Tartaria, the northern state, started from the territory of modern Iraq and Iran, namely from the lake of Tartar. That's why it was called as Tartaria. So, hey, Turkish media, don't need to claim that this territory allegedly once belonged to the Ottoman Empire. It has never been, and I really hope will never be like that. Thus, we see that all this story, which started today in the Caucasus, will not stop. This is a chance to regain the Ottoman Empire by the 500th anniversary after the death of Selim I. And what did I start this video with? Remember that we have forgotten that the Ottoman Empire is not a distant Middle Ages, but just 100 years ago. In 1923, on March the 3rd, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, and this is almost 1920. It means that 100 years later, in 2020, Erdogan really wants to revive the Ottoman Empire in order to hand it over to God Marduk further. As you can see, the situation is very dangerous. But what will happen next? Further, the military front will spread towards Kazakhstan, and here our peoples will have to make a decision. They will enter the war together with Turkey against Russia, or still they will go against Turkey. But taking into account the fact that the modern capital of Kazakhstan, Nur-Sultan, is being built mostly in the Ottoman traditions, I'm not even talking about the word Sultan in its name, it seems to us that this is what we gave our predictions about in 2018, that Kazakhstan will choose the Ottoman Empire. That's why, for example, now Latin letters are inherent there and not Russian Cyrillic. That suggests that it has long been decided that this state will enter the Ottoman Empire in the future. Also, I remind you, in our previous video, the world is on the verge of a catastrophe. We showed you a map of the future disasters, and Turkey will be completely torn apart and destroyed. This state will soon be gone, which means that the Ottoman Empire must move to the east. Otherwise, it will be completely destroyed. They will not allow this, because these are the last priests of the cult of the god Marduk. Consequently, Nur-Sultan and the western territories of Kazakhstan will subsequently be inhabited by Turks, and this will be the future Turkey. Therefore, I once again appeal to the peoples of Azerbaijan and Georgia, who will very soon betray Russia, as well as to Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. You will be deceived. They will tell you that a new world order where you will have a very significant and very beautiful and satisfying role is being built. But recall the history of the Ottoman Empire. They do not leave allies. Their challenge is to completely clear the territory, to destroy at the root all the peoples who now inhabit these territories. If you do not sign an agreement with Turkey now, then that very small contract between Ukraine and Turkey will not matter much. It's not gonna work. After all, Rus has the strength and power to fight against Ukraine and Turkey, and there is almost no chance for Rus to fight the whole Ottoman Khaganate and Ukraine together. Therefore, we are now talking about the revival of a unified spirit, a single huge people who once inhabited this territory. The Caucasian territory is also Ruskoland. These are the territories of Central Asia and Asia Minor. These are the territories of modern China and India. These are the territories of Siam or Thailand, almost all of North and Central America. And we now live at the time when we are divided, and it's very important to recall the real history. Also, taking this opportunity, I appeal to the people of North and South America as well as Canadians. I highly recommend you in the near future to think about moving. By 2023, this area will be subject to disasters that you don't even know about. These territories will be destroyed by nature, and this is an inevitable process. Return back to the sacred Russian land in order to defend and finally defeat once and for all that very Sumerian civilization, and by March the 5th, 2053, we either revive Rus or restart the Matrix again. The choice is up to us.